It's kind of empty and sad, isn't it?
Hey everyone, my name is John Skylines, and welcome to the game that I invented, City Skylines 2. Now, boy has it been a while since the last video, and there's a lot to discuss there, but I think you'll find that today's video is quite eventful. The idea was pretty straightforward. Use the new German region pack to make a German-style district for the city. But like all straightforward ideas, this turned out much bigger than expected, and honestly gave a lot more character to the city than I expected. Now, the keen-eyed among you might have noticed that we're not working on the German district right now, we're working on the trams. And I knew I was going to have a tram line run along the district, but before I implemented that line, I wanted to do a slight reorganizing of the city's tram network. So that was essentially the scope of this video. I would reorganize the tram network, basically just, delete the old lines and make new ones, and then I'd make the German district, right? Sounds pretty simple enough. If only I knew. Now, actually, the tram network restructuring wasn't that bad, and you can see the work I'm putting in to do that right now. Really, the largest part of restructuring the tram network is redoing that central plaza where all of the lines essentially terminate near the main train station, and you'll see that in just a little bit. But apart from that, I literally upgraded the roads to remove the tracks, and then I planned out new lines and put new tracks down. And so you can see I'm doing some of that track work here. I figured I'm not going to show all of it on camera because it's a very repetitive and boring task. You guys know how to upgrade roads. But I thought it is worth showing that, to make them feel a little more realistic, I am going to a lot of the intersections, especially where there's tight, like 90-degree curves, like the intersection here. And I'm just using Move It to push those nodes back a little bit and give those wider radius turns for the trams. I do think if you're trying to make something of a realistic tram network in your city, it is worthwhile going around and fixing up your intersections this way, because those really tight radiuses they don't change the way that the trams work. Like, the trams in City Skylines will still take them, but if you look at something like this, it's completely unrealistic. It's way too tight for any kind of tram vehicle to be able to make that. So yeah, it's a nice simple step, but it goes a long way. Okay, so while I'm doing this, I figured I'd talk a little bit about where I've been, because my Mriyaslava track record has really fallen off. We were doing great in 2024, like an episode a month, and then we had August with the city blocks, then I went to January with the port, and now it's July, or at least I hope it'll release in July with this episode. Now, many of you know, and I've talked a little bit about this before, that I've been going to university for my engineering degree, and I'm very happy and proud to say that I finished it. I got my diploma, and yeah, that's honestly the main thing that was keeping me from doing the videos, all the studying and doing those final exams for, the literal final time. But yeah, now it's over, and then it went straight to full-time job searching, and now I'm working, so it never ends. During my job search, I've had a couple people, like friends and family, ask me if I'd ever consider, or if I even could do YouTube full-time. And to be honest, I think it's something I could do, and I have to some extent before. Like, there was a very brief period where I was pumping videos out pretty quickly. I think that was with Edinburgh though, so not sure if that really counts. But yeah, I've always really enjoyed having YouTube as a hobby. But I do acknowledge that I need to be a little more consistent with it and a little better with it, having it not be 7 or 6 months between video uploads. And I really am trying. This video was supposed to be the first example of me putting that plan of more consistent videos into effect, because I've been thinking that, you know, the scope of what I do in every video is a bit large. I need to narrow it down, you know, have a clear goal in every video. And I thought in this one that would be perfect. A German district and just a little bit of trams. Two very clear things. I didn't think they'd be, you know, huge deals, but they'd be still, you know, decent sized projects. But no, the district we'll build in this video ended up being basically half the size of the existing city before it. Like it was insane, and I didn't realize it until I was essentially done with it already. And you know, I'm not blaming anyone, that's completely my fault. But what I'm taking away from that is that I need to be even more narrow with my scope in the future. So I'm not sure what that'll look like yet, but I think in the case of this video, it probably would have been either the trams or the German district. And you know, maybe I could have split it up, but the work was so integrated with each other that I didn't really want to. I felt like it deserved to be in the same video. But yeah, I didn't want to do just a German district, you know, for Mriyaslava as a whole. I wanted there to be like a French one. I wanted there to be, you know, Eastern European, because this city is supposed to be, you know, somewhat Eastern European. But I think, you know, if or when I do that in the future, it is going to be split up. Either it's going to be a smaller district or a smaller part of that district, or maybe I'll just do like the road layout in one video and the buildings in another. But yeah, I need to split it up, because with the scope of what I did in this video, it ended up being, you know, almost 50 minutes, as you can see. But anyways, I think that's enough meta commentary, so let's get back into the video. And right now, I'm putting down the tram lines, the new tram lines. And so you can see here, if you remember what the previous ones looked like, and I'll show a comparison image a little bit later, that this line is much more linear. You know, it's an actual line, which is crazy. Who would think of that, considering we literally call them tram lines and transit lines? Now, like I mentioned before, the biggest part of the tram side of this video is this plaza here and these tram loops. Because I realized, well, not that I realized, I mean, I knew the land was there. It was just a big plot of unused land. We had a couple paths. We had the lead tracks going from the tram depot, and I just filled it out with a bunch of trees. And it's such a waste of space, considering this is like the prime real estate downtown. This is where the core of the city is, right next to the main train station, and I felt like I should do something a little bit more grand. Now, generally for Mriyaslava, I've been looking at the Czech Republic a lot, and I mean specifically Prague, for inspiration and references. And the tram loops are no exception. I looked at how a lot of the tram lines terminate in Prague, and I really liked that they have these double tracks at part of the loop, I guess as a sort of siding to store extra trams. And so I've tried to replicate that by having part of the loop be double tracked instead of single tracked. A piece of advice though, if you try to go with a similar setup, only have one stop on the loop, and probably on the furthest end, so right before it re-enters the main track. You know, have it loop around and then stop. Because this ended up being actually a really big headache that I couldn't figure out for a long time. If you look at a lot of the tram loop setups, I mean, like the ones I was referencing in Prague, they have two stops. You know, there's one at the beginning of the loop and one at the end, I guess for the beginning and the end of the line, respectively. But when I tried to replicate that here, the trams they had a very hard time with the pathfinding for some reason. They kept backing up and switching tracks, and then they'd collide in each other, and all the vehicles would despawn. And I think it was because the stop segment, so you can see here where the stops are based off, you know, where the people are. I think it just was too short, and so when the tram was stopping, you know, part of the lead car would be on one track, but it had to be on the other. Anyways, don't bother doing that. Just have one stop, have it loop around, and then it'll be able to go wherever it's needed to. Now, as for decorating the loops and detailing them, something that I've been trying to use a lot of is surfaces. They're a very, quick and powerful way to detail an area and to fill it out. There's a lot of variety. You can download packs from Paradox mods. And so that's what you can see me doing there. Basically, all the areas where I knew I wanted pedestrians to walk, I have this one color tile, or I guess one type of tile, and then you'll see later I fill out everything else with another type. Now, in my opinion, the key thing with surfaces and materials, and this applies, not just for city skylines, but even for just general environment art, is the transitions between different materials. When you have two different materials and you just have them side by side, it looks very wrong, right? There's no transition. It's a very sharp contrast between the two. But if you have some kind of trim between the two, or in this case you saw I put that edge curb around the inside of the track and the outside as well, it acts as a sort of transition. It's a barrier. It cordons off that one material and separates it from the other. And I think it's a very nice piece of detail. It is tedious to do here because it's a network and you have to, move it around and adjust it to the curves. But it does really make those surfaces feel more grounded and integrated with the surroundings. Now, when I was thinking how I would fill this area out, I knew I wanted it to be a plaza. I didn't want like buildings or shops there. I wanted a nice, clear sight line to the train station. But you don't want it to just be this like tile desert, like just this one big square with one texture. You want to break it up a little and make it, look interesting. So the way that I try to, and I would hope succeed at doing that, is to just break it up a little. I have different surfaces for different purposes, and then I have also these little areas with foliage in between to break it up as well. So this kind of sandy tile that I have right in the center of this tram loop, I only use for the center of the tram loops, right? It kind of denotes that space. And then I have this striped tile where people would walk, and it denotes where people should be traversing. It's the high trafficked part of the plaza. And to break that up even further, I'll have these little areas with foliage, and you can kind of see me already starting to do that with those teardrop shaped areas in the center of the tram loops. Now, I did want this area to look nice, but I also wanted it to be functional. So you saw just a second ago I put down those invisible pedestrian paths, and that lets people actually walk across the plaza, not just on the tram tracks or, walk by it on the pedestrian road I have here. Now, something that I really wanted to use, but I couldn't figure out, are those like gathering and park areas. I don't remember which menu they're in, but they work kind of like the surface tool I'm using here, where you can just draw out an area. If this is an area where a park is supposed to be, or this is an area where citizens are supposed to sort of just hang around. And I tried putting those down, but I didn't find that any citizens were actually using them. So I ended up removing them and clearing them out. So yeah, if anybody knows anything about those, it would be nice to get some details, but I don't think they were necessary in the end. People did use those invisible pedestrian paths, and it ended up being a nice functional plaza. Now here you can see how I'm filling out the majority of the plaza with this one tile pattern, and crucially, as you'll see in a second, I'm doing it manually. And I tried very hard to line up the patterns, so even if I split it up like I did in this case, it would still match and it would look like one sort of continuous surface. But very soon after, I discovered the area bucket mod, and I think as of the last update to the game, it is broken, but in the time that I was able to use it, it was really quite useful, and you can see how it works here, where essentially you can define what it will use as a boundary. So in this case, I think I set it to be net lanes, networks, and other surfaces, and it just sort of calculates an area to fill in between them. It's not perfect. I think it's still in beta, and so you can see it kind of misses parts of shapes sometimes. But compared to doing it manually, it is a huge time saver. And one downside, or I won't say it's a downside, I guess it's more of a caveat, is that the orientation of every shape that you place will look a little bit different because it depends on the angle of the first segment you put down. But in my case, I was actually happy to have that because it broke up the pattern and made it look a little bit more dynamic instead of just this one consistent, I guess, grid is what the tile pattern looked like. So yeah, it might not be applicable in every case. In some cases, doing it manually might still give the desired result, but either way, it's a good tool to have. Now, apart from the plaza, there were still a couple of, I guess I'll call them ancillary things I wanted to do for the tram network. So you can see here in our church district, Novosviato, I put down this extra depot. Essentially, up to this point, we were running off the one depot that was right next to the plaza, and it was a huge bottleneck. I mean, it was upgraded with the storage extension or whatever, but it was still not enough for all our lines. They were constantly complaining there were never enough vehicles. So I knew there needed to be another one, and I think this was a good place to put it because we do have a bunch of tram lines running through this area, and it's just a good way to fill out this part of the land because it wasn't really being used beforehand anyways. Now this essentially does it for the tram side of this episode, but you can really see here, the difference this made. So how the tram lines were before versus the configuration we have them in now, much more directed, much more linear. So instead of being, chaotic and unorganized how they were before, they will hopefully have a better purpose now. And going off of the usage statistics that I've been looking at, since this episode was completed, did seem to be effective. So I think it was worthwhile. The lowest ridership one is that second horizontal one that kind of ends in the middle of nowhere right now. That is where I wanted to put a French district in the future. So it doesn't really have a destination right now, but we will rectify that in the future. It's a bit of future planning. Now, I think transitioning very nicely from the tram side of things to the actual district, my first, task essentially was to create the road network for the district. And the first part of that was establishing the main road. So that's what I'm doing here. And I've created a nice little custom tram road with Road Builder. I really like this configuration that I've seen in a couple of other European cities where the tram tracks are still in their own right-of-way, and they're segregated from the road lanes, but it's not like its own entire alignment. It's still part of the road. And so I figure, since Road Builder is a thing, I should be taking more advantage of that. And yeah, it's a pretty simple road setup, but I like that it's a bit of a unique road. While I'm figuring out the layout, I'm also putting service buildings down and trying to actually build the layout around them a little bit so they both kind of influence each other. In this case, I knew where I wanted to put another tram depot, and so I'm snaking out these tram tracks right out to it from where this main avenue ends. I mentioned earlier why I couldn't split the video up into, the tram part and the German part, and this is kind of why, just because they are really intertwined. I really did want this tram network to be part of the district, even though it only sort of goes by one side of it. I think it's important enough because it's the main form of transportation that serves it, apart from the train station that sort of borders between it and the church district. For those of you that have been following the city or have a decent idea of how it's laid out, you might have already been thinking about what the highway connection would look like, and you'd be completely right to think about that because the existing one was very low capacity and it was already having problems long before this episode. In all my years of playing City Skylines and building highways and interchanges, one interchange that I've never done is Diverging Diamond. And that's exactly what I decided to do here. I thought it would be a fun challenge, and I thought it would also be a good place to try it, because we do need something high capacity here, and Diverging Diamond is able to support that, or at the very least I thought it would, and I guess we'll see how it works out. I'm getting started with just the overpass, so I put down the two roads parallel to each other, and then I'm actually upgrading the middle segments to be elevated. I found that I've been really specifying what type of road it is manually lately, instead of letting the game automatically decide if it should be elevated or not. It gives you a little bit of more control, so you can see how I have that established there with just the middle segment being elevated. I was actually a little bit surprised at how compact I was able to make it. I mean, even just the on and off ramps. I think I'm maybe just too accustomed to making giant interchanges and having, you know, an infinite amount of space to work in, essentially. But yeah, it ended up fitting into quite a small space, and I think we'll be able to develop a pretty significant portion of the land around it. I think for me, part of the problem is that I'm just so used to, you know, like maximizing the turning radius for trains or trams or whatever, but yeah, you really don't need that with these smaller vehicles. That's something I'm trying to work on, and yeah, I think I succeeded in this case, and you'll see that in the full overview shot later. Now, I think the star of the show for a Diverging Diamond is the point at which the lanes cross over, right, where you have right-hand drive switches to left-hand drive. And so that's what I'm doing here. I think my approach to this was a little bit incorrect. I really should have spread out the nodes on both ends, not just on the left side like you see here, because it ended up with this very strange configuration. Like you can see, it's very wonky. I still ended up making it work, but yeah, at the time when I was doing this, I just didn't think of, you know, using Move It to give more space between the roads and then moving them back later. That's definitely what I would recommend if you were to try to do this yourself. Either way, like I said, with enough, you know, dicking around with Move It, you can get it to look pretty decent, and you can smooth out the way the intersection looks. It's just, you know, a little bit of extra work. Actually, you know, it's kind of strange. I had a decent number of issues with Move It while I was making this episode. There were a couple times where it would break, you know, not to the point of crashing the game, but to the point that I'd still have to reload it anyways. Like I wouldn't be able to select stuff anymore, or it would, you know, be glitching out. But yeah, obviously it is still a huge help, you know, when doing basically any kind of detailed work. Like you can see here, me fidgeting around with the segments. Yeah, I do still wish it had a couple of extra features though. Copy and paste, I think, is the biggest one. It would be such a time saver being able to select, like, I don't know, groups of trees or props and copy them a couple times. But yeah, it's getting there. Part of keeping it compact is also just avoiding unnecessary lanes wherever possible. So here, for example, I don't have a second lane that merges into that on-ramp. It all just becomes one lane immediately, and it works pretty well based off what I've seen. You know, it handles the capacity, but obviously if we need to in the future, we can change that to 2 lanes. Now, with the backbone of the district in place, I got into actually doing the city roads, essentially. And you can see I've already started on it there. I have a decent grid, and I am trying to keep it more grid-like compared to the, I guess, more polygonal shapes that I have downtown. And that's going to be something that I try to extend, you know, beyond just this district in general. The custom hand-placed city blocks are nice, but obviously we can't do that everywhere if we want, you know, there to be consistent and timely progress. But still here, I think it was simple enough that I could do it. One of the differences between how I'm doing it here and how I did it downtown is just that the blocks are a lot smaller. The city blocks I had downtown in Mriyaslava were just massive, and looking back on it now, I would have done it differently. They came out fine. I'm not going to be redoing them, but that's one of the lessons I took away when I was doing this. By the way, I should mention about those buildings in the corner there. Don't worry, I'm not skipping out on footage or anything. That was just a bit of a test build that I did before this episode, just to see if, I can arrange the buildings in a nice way, how they kind of come together, and just, I guess, get a good sense of what they look like. But I won't be placing any of the actual residential buildings down, or I guess the zonables, until I've got all the service buildings down. For example, like this signature building as part of the pack. I think this is a mall, it's supposed to be. It's a very pretty building, and so I wanted to place it down first so I can sort of plan around it and have nice sight lines. And so what I'm doing right now is I'm just setting up the road in front of it. I wanted there to be some dedicated bus lanes right in front of it specifically, since it'll be something of a destination. I'm not doing anything crazy for the sight lines, I'm not clearing roads out or having them all, point at it or anything. When I say sight lines, I just mean it helps me plan out what buildings to place around it. So, around this mall, I could place buildings that are a bit shorter, right? So you can see it from further away, and it ends up having a bigger impact on the skyline. I did want this area to look very pretty and lush though, so you can see I added trees to that road right in front of it, as well as this pedestrian street that sort of leads directly to it. I think that the pack does have several other signature buildings, if I'm not mistaken, but I really only bothered placing this one down beforehand because I wanted it to act as a sort of centerpiece of the district. I did something similar with Novosviatoho, with Notre Dame. I mean, that's the reason it's called Novosviatoho, like New Holiness, right? It's the reason why I call it the church district. And I think it's good to have something like that in every district. It really gives it like a purpose and its own identity, and that's kind of what I wanted it to be for this German district. Apart from the mall, I also put down all the different service buildings that we'll need, taking particular care with education and elementary schools, because those seem to always fill up so quickly and there's never enough of them. So I think I put down like 3 or 4 in this district alone. Now in just a moment you're going to see that once I'm done with the service buildings, I went ahead and I placed down all the actual growables, although they're not growing, I am putting them down by hand. And that's what really took up the most time for this episode, because the district was just a lot larger than I thought it was, and I had to go around and place them all manually. I decided to do this off camera just because it is a pretty boring and repetitive task. But if you like, you can go watch episode 7 of this series, where I went over the first time I did this kind of realistic European city block in the core of the city. Despite how long it took, I mean, you can see, I think it was worth it. It turned out beautiful, and I think that it really did add a lot of new character to the city. But don't worry, we're not done yet, because one of the things that I really wanted to do as part of this new district is revamp the train station that we have in the neighboring church district. We got a bunch of new train stations since the last videos I've made. I think this one here is the historic train station, and the reason that I really wanted to use this one in particular is because it has a back entrance, and because it's situated literally right between the two districts, we can connect them that way, and we can let people enter from both districts, or even cross into the other district by walking through it. Now, the reason I'm not showing build footage of me actually building this train station is because somehow that footage from this part of the video got corrupted. And it's funny because normally I'd be, pretty upset about that, but in this case, I think it might actually be a blessing, because I think the video is already long enough as is. I think that the key thing with the train station, a lot like the plaza, is just a lot of the surface work that I did. And you can see this is the back entrance that connects to the German district. I really do think it came out quite nicely. And yeah, it was just a matter of, figuring out which surfaces fit the area and don't look too noisy. And yeah, I think it really paid off. I also added this little bus terminal to the left side of the train station. Previously, there was just nothing sitting here, even though it was part of the plot of land that the train station sits on. It was just kind of empty, so I thought this would be a good place to put it. It was the perfect size, and yeah, it ended up getting quite a bit of usage. And with that was essentially the bulk of the district done. So you can see how it turned out over here. And I'll also point out I put some high-rise buildings over there near the train station. Those are just some low-rent apartments. I always try to put a couple of those down per district, and usually near some kind of transit stop, just so that we have a bit of transit-oriented development. So in keeping with the Ukrainian names that I've been using for districts elsewhere, I decided to call this district Nemetsko, which in Ukrainian is very on the nose and is an almost like corny name for a German district, but I think in English it sounds original and different enough, so it's cute, what the hell. The next thing I worked on was a bus line that runs through the district. Now obviously we have the tram line there flanking it, as well as the train station, but I wanted there to be a bus connection as well. So you can see here I'm planning it out, and I'm having it run basically downtown to the main terminal we have there. So it's pretty straightforward. It is literally just a line, but I think it's in a good spot. It runs through the center of the district. So it's servicing people that are a little bit further from the tram line. I've been trying to come up with some kind of naming and numbering scheme for the bus lines. I mean, not just the bus lines, but all the transit lines in the city. And so you can see me here. I'm naming stuff to fit that convention. One day I'd really like to use the Write Everywhere mod so that the line names are actually displayed on like buses and trams and stuff. I don't really like how the current implementation of it looks, because you have these basically just these giant blocks sticking out of the buses that have the names on it. So I'm just kind of waiting around to see if maybe anything will change, but yeah, I think that'll be maybe a cool thing to try out in the future. Now, a lot of the detailing this episode, if you can call it that, has been very macro scale, like surfaces over large areas, maybe some planters within that, but I don't really go into anything much more fine grained other than that. But I couldn't resist, and I figured that the tram line we have here would be a perfect place to do some of that, because I have very few stops, but those stops can get some love, and I think it adds a nice balance of detail versus undetailed areas in the city. So you can see what I'm doing is I'm putting down some tactile strips. I put down those truncated domes on the platform edge, and then I have these tactile paving tiles that stretch out across the platform and lead towards it. I didn't do anything crazy like in the first global collab when I had the LED signage and I put the custom station names down and everything. I mean, not that you can even do that in City Skylines 2 yet, but I did put down a couple of these shelters, and you can see the horrible LOD here. But yeah, that was essentially the extent of the detail that I did at the platforms. But I still think it does add a nice touch, because usually when you look at the transit lines, you're going to be looking at where the stops are, and it's good to give some extra love to that. Now obviously, just because I'm doing some prop and net lane detailing here doesn't mean I'm not using surfaces. I did do a decent amount of surface work here as well. So at the stations, I decided all the station areas would be just have like a concrete foundation, but then for the rest of the tramway I decided to go with a grass, I don't know what you would call it, a grass track, just grass under the tracks. I saw a lot of these tramways around Europe. There are a couple in Munich that I looked at specifically, since this was a German district, but actually we have a couple of these in Kiev as well that I remember. And I always thought they're just they're nice. Instead of being concrete or gravel or something, it's a nice little bit of foliage. I also added some dashed lines wherever the tram tracks cross the road. In this case, it was in an intersection. I'm not sure if there's any standard for when tram tracks cross the road in terms of markings, but I just went the safe route with some dashed lines. And then the other little bit of detailing I did is just I went around the platform areas and added some drains and some manhole covers. I do wish that drains were more or less automatically placed or just part of the networks, because they're kind of a ubiquitous part of roads wherever you go, and yet here they're not really found anywhere. I always thought that was a bit of a missing detail. For the last part of this build, I wanted to have an industrial area next to the district, since we're already right next to our first industrial area that we built in the city. So it made sense to kind of have that transition. And I was really inspired by this one particular area of Nuremberg that has all these factories and warehouses lined up in rows. I thought it looked really pretty, and it actually fit really well with the rest of there was residential buildings right next to it. So that's what I'm trying to replicate here. I don't think I have ever been able to make a nice looking industrial area in City Skylines or City Skylines 2 just by pure zoning. With residential, you can get away with it. It's already generally in grids, and especially if you have dense housing, if you just zone it on a grid and let it grow out naturally, it's usually fine. But with industrial areas, I find that the buildings just don't really lend themselves to that. You have to be very particular with the zoning, not filling out the grid entirely. And even if you do, fill out the grid, I think that the buildings are a little too, comically industrial, if that makes sense. They all have these giant smokestacks and everything, and they don't really look planned out. If you look at real industrial areas, they're pretty, they have campuses, right? Each industry has its own little area. Each company has a couple of buildings or, their own warehouses. So I find that to make a good looking industrial area, you do need to have a decent amount of manual tweaking there. The way I'm getting around this here is just by placing down all the buildings that have warehouse in the name, and then I'm recoloring them so they all look like one unit, essentially. I do find that there are still some building types missing that I would have really liked to use in this area. When I think industrial or warehouse area, I think of those brick buildings with the serrated roofs, that have the skylights to let the sun in. And the biggest building size in City Skylines 2 that isn't a signature building is 6x6 grid units, right? But if you think of an industrial warehouse like the one I mentioned, that's at least 6 units wide, but it's going to be quite a lot longer than that. And with the way that the game manages the building sizes, it doesn't really work. So there isn't anything like that to choose from right now. But who knows? Maybe when we get the asset editor and we start seeing more custom buildings on Paradox mods, I'll come back and I'll add some of those back in. The part of Nuremberg I was referencing for this had a decent amount of empty land bordering with the residential area that I guess serves as a surface parking lot. So I kind of tried to mimic that here with some parking lot roads. I didn't feel like a parking garage would really fit well here because the industrial area is pretty low to the ground, right? You don't really have tall buildings, so I felt like that a parking garage would kind of stick out, and that the surface lots transitioned well between the taller residential buildings and the warehouses we have here. Something else I realized while I was doing the industrial area is that I don't have a lot of gas stations in the city. So I actually went around, you can see I put the one here in the industrial area, but I went around the entire city, putting down just a couple of gas stations here and there. I don't think, cars actually treat them as gas stations. Like, I don't think that's a building type, that vehicles are required to visit, but it just made sense to me to have a couple of those here and there. So yeah, I went around and rectified that. Once again, I'm using a lot of surfaces here to fill in the empty areas, or at least, break them up a little bit. I noticed that a lot of the industrial areas I looked at, like on Google Maps, they're just like a sea of concrete and asphalt. So I'm trying to replicate that a little bit. And again, I'm using net lanes here. In this case, I'm just using this vanilla curb asset to border off those surfaces and integrate them a little bit more into the area. I'm actually doing it kind of backwards here. I think it's probably best to put down the net lane, like the curb, and then go in with the surface, since you don't have to adjust anything. You can just, trace out the surface where the curb or whatever your border is. But that's something I realized a little bit too late. So just a bit of a pro tip, I guess. Another bit of extra detail I did specifically for this industrial area is putting down these overgrown expansion joints. I don't know why, but when I think of like these big concrete planes like you see here, I always really associate them with having those lines or the gaps between the panels that just have weeds growing out of them. I don't know if anybody knows what I'm talking about. Maybe I just sound completely crazy, but for whatever reason, that's what I associate it with. So I tried to replicate that a little bit. Something else that I tried to replicate is the weathered feeling that the surfaces have when you look at areas like this. I usually don't go overboard with decals or stain decals and making everything look dirty. I quite like the generally clean appearance that the buildings and the textures in City Skylines 2 have. But for this industrial area, it just felt right. And I think it ended up paying off. It really did break up the even surfaces, and it definitely made it look a lot more realistic. Prop detailing industrial areas is actually surprisingly simple. Just put down rows of boxes or pallets. That's all you need. Don't need to overthink it. It really does do the trick. I see a lot of people detail industrial areas with pipes and cisterns and generators and just industrial looking things. But the truth is that industry is really all about volume, right? Usually you're selling stuff, you're transporting some kind of good. So just putting a bunch of shipments of things outside or having a bunch of box trucks lined up in a row is enough to call it a day. And the very, very last thing I do in this episode is build one final tram loop to terminate the line that runs through this German district. And this one is inspired by a very specific loop in the north of Prague. And I try to replicate it by having this sidewalk, I guess, in the middle of the tracks to kind of act like the tram foundation you might have seen before in other places. I don't think it quite looks the same, but it's close enough, and I think it fits the general concrete aesthetic that we've gone for this area. And yeah, it ended up just being the perfect size for that. The loop I was referencing for this had a ton of asphalt and concrete patching as well. I'll be honest, I don't really have a technique for this, even the area that I was doing earlier. I kind of just go off of what I see in the reference. It's really strange. It's both chaotic but structured at the same time. I guess when they pick out the areas that they're going to patch, they mark out a specific area. It's not just the one patch, it's a region of it, I guess. And yeah, I don't know how to systematically replicate that. So I literally just look at the patterns I see in my reference and and place the patches to look like that. Something else I did here, but that I didn't end up recording, is a nice big foliage pass with a bunch of like trees and bushes, and I used a lot of grass textures to break up the ground as well, which I haven't done before. The reason I couldn't record it is because it's winter right now and the snow is covering everything, and by the time all of that melted, I just didn't have time to record it anymore, but you'll see it in the cinematics later. I think it turned out pretty well. Anyways, that just about does it for this video. We did a lot in this episode, and it took a long time, but despite that, I think that we made some really good progress. I think the builds turned out great, and I'm really happy with how everything turned out. I'll have a nice cinematic overview in just a second, but I'd love to hear what you thought of the build, so please leave a comment and let me know. And if you have any ideas or suggestions for what I should do in the next episode, I'd love to hear that as well. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.